5 insanely daring historical air raids. Number 5. The Cuxhaven Raid. The common story of Christmas 1914 is the Christmas Day Truce, where soldiers on both sides stopped fighting to celebrate the holiday during World War I. While that was happening in the trenches, the British were conducting a historic airstrike on the German Navy. Intelligence reports showed that Cuxhaven had Zeppelin sheds, where the giant airships were being kept. From the start of the war, Zeppelins had menaced the British. No fighter planes could catch the airships, and they flew unmolested over UK airspace. Thus, the Navy hatched their plan: if they couldn't destroy the airships in the air, they would destroy them on the ground. Unfortunately, the sheds were out of range for ground-based airplanes. However, British commanders really wanted to raid the sheds, so they developed an imaginative plan to use sea-based airplanes. There was no such thing as an aircraft carrier at the time, but the British improvised. Using converted passenger ferries that could carry seaplanes, the British planned to move their naval forces as close to Germany as possible and then launch the seaplanes to bomb the Zeppelin sheds. On the day of the raid, only 7 airplanes were able to take off, but soon, the incredibly brave pilots were on their way to Cuxhaven. Even then, the weather didn't cooperate. Heavy fog blanketed the sheds, and anti-aircraft fire stopped some of the attackers from getting close to their target. Nevertheless, all the British airplanes survived the attack. The pilots had to ditch in the sea and were picked up by British submarines and Dutch trawlers. The raid itself was not incredibly destructive, but it was a sign of things to come. By adopting new military tactics, the British proved that shipborne air attacks were possible, leading to further use of naval airplanes in World War I and later wars. Number 4. The sinking of the Tirpitz. Right before World War II, Nazi Germany built 2 gigantic battleships, the Bismarck and the Tirpitz. Both ships caused great concern for Allied forces and the British in particular. Throughout the war, British forces were constantly trying to sink the ships. In 1941, a combined bomber and surface ship attack sunk the Bismarck, but the first attacks on the Tirpitz were not as successful. For 3 years, the British tried to sink the Tirpitz. Carrier strikes conducted by the Fleet Air Arm proved ineffective against the giant battleship. The British became more and more desperate. After trying daring midget submarine attacks, the responsibility for sinking the ship transferred to Bomber Command in 1944. Fortunately, they just developed a new bomb called the Tallboy. The huge bomb weighed 5,400 kilograms and hit with just enough force to buckle battleship armor. Soon, Bomber Command hatched a plan to use the bombs to sink the Tirpitz. Since the Tallboy was so big, the only airplane that could fly the mission was the Lancaster bomber, which was usually used for high-altitude night bombings. For this mission, the bombers had to fly low during the day. Hitting the ship required precision flying and aiming. Flying from bases in the Soviet Union, Bomber Command conducted 2 unsuccessful attacks in the fall of 1944. Smoke screens and intercepting fighters ruined both missions. On November 15, a third mission launched. For most of the mission, 30 Lancasters flew 300 meters above the ground, under enemy radar. Then, as they approached the battleship's mooring, the bombers quickly climbed to a bombing height of 3,600 meters, which was necessary for the Tallboy to gain enough energy during its descent. The Tirpitz opened fire with everything it had, trying to shoot down the planes with its main guns. With the smoke screen inoperable, the bombers had a clear sight of the target. 3 bombs hit and sunk the ship. Only 1 Lancaster was shot down. Number 3. Operation Opera. In the late 1970s, the Iraqi government purchased a nuclear reactor from the French. While both countries claimed that the reactor was purely for scientific research, Israel was more suspicious. Having a nuclear reactor in the region was a big concern. Early 1980s intelligence estimates believed that Iraq would have nuclear weapons within the decade. Quickly, The Israelis attempted to seek a diplomatic solution to their problem by trying to convince European powers to stop funding the reactor. Diplomacy failed, so the Israeli military began to plan a daring strike against the reactor without consulting other nations. Israel would use US-built F-16s and F-15s for the attack. Engineers stripped down 8 F-16s to carry as many munitions as possible. The F-15s would provide air support. Overall, the mission would require the jets to fly 1,000 kilometers over 3 enemy countries. For most of the mission, the fighters would fly only 46 meters off the ground. On June 7, 1981, the attack force took off. Their flight took them over Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and then Iraq. Careful planning gave the fighters a path that avoided ground-based radar and enemy airfields. Even though the planes were so close to the ground, nobody knew they were coming until they got to Iraq. King Hussein of Jordan was visiting Iraq that day and saw the low-flying jets screaming overhead. He quickly tried to get a warning to the Iraqi military, but it was too late. The F-16s dropped their bombs and annihilated the reactor. They then climbed to 12,000 meters, flew over Jordan, and returned home. The reactor was gone, which stopped any hopes that Iraq had of nuclear power or weapons. Number 2. The Doolittle Raid. One of the most famous air raids conducted by the United States during World War II, the Doolittle Raid is a mission that most people have heard of but don't realize how absolutely insane it was. The raid was a retribution for the attack on Pearl Harbor, which brought the U.S. into World War II. Military planners wanted to conduct a retaliatory air raid, but the only problem was that they didn't have airplanes with a long enough range to hit the Japanese home islands. Hotshot pilot Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle had an idea: launch ground-based medium bombers from a carrier on a one-way strike over Japan. Training of volunteer bomber crews started immediately. The B-25 bombers used for the raid usually needed 360 meters of runway distance, but the aircraft carrier USS Hornet only had a 150-meter deck. Eventually, the crews figured out how to take off in that distance. To make it work, the B-25s had to cut as much weight as possible. All unnecessary equipment left out of the planes. On April 18, 1942, the mission commenced earlier than expected. The carrier group made contact with Japanese picket ships. Although escort ships sunk the Japanese pickets, the surprise was lost. The mission launched 10 hours earlier than expected and 270 kilometers further away from Japan than planned. Doolittle's B-25 took off first. His bomber's job was to fly alone over Tokyo and mark the targets with incendiary bombs. An hour after Doolittle left, 15 other bombers took off, each barely making it off the aircraft carrier. Roaring in at 600 meters, the bombers attacked Japanese industrial targets. After they dropped their bombs, the B-25s were too fast for intercepting Japanese fighters to catch them. Then came the really dangerous part: landing in Japanese-occupied China. Most crews touched down in China and met up with local resistance leaders. One crew landed in the Soviet Union and got interned. 8 crew members were captured by the Japanese, and 3 were executed. Overall, the mission did minimal damage, but it boosted U.S. morale while crushing the Japanese leadership. Number 1. Operation Focus. In 1967, Israel's neighbors began to build up their militaries to attack the small state. Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Jordan were the primary allies against Israel. Each had a sizable air force that could decimate the Israeli forces quickly. With Israel facing a war against several countries, military planners realized that the only way to turn the upcoming conflict in their favor was to conduct a preemptive airstrike against their enemies' combined air forces. Known as Operation Focus, this airstrike was one of the biggest in recent history. Israeli pilots mostly flew French Mirage fighter planes loaded with bombs. Nearly 200 aircraft lifted off on June 5. This huge strike force constituted the majority of the Israeli Air Force. Only a few interceptors stayed behind to patrol friendly airspace. It was quite literally an all-or-nothing attack. On the first wave, the Israeli pilots hit 11 Egyptian bases, catching most of the Egyptian airplanes on the ground, unable to respond to the attack. After the first wave, the Israeli pilots returned to base and were reloaded with bombs, taking off again in under 10 minutes for the next wave. When the second wave was successful, the pilots conducted one more attack, once again reloading and refueling in less than 10 minutes. All of these attacks occurred in the space of 3 hours. In the end, 500 Egyptian, Syrian, Iraqi, and Jordanian planes lay burning on the ground, decimated by the Israeli strikes. Israel took minimal losses of only 19 airplanes. With the coalition air force destroyed, Israel maintained air superiority for the rest of the Six-Day War.